Gideon Rusk didn't whisper it. He said it loud, loud enough for every man, woman, and auctioneer within 30 feet to hear. Somebody stop that fool woman before she wastes what little she's got left. Mara Whitlock was already holding the bidding card. Her hand didn't shake. Her jaw didn't drop. She just stood there in her father's old work coat, the one with the fraying left cuff and the faded tobacco smell she could never quite wash out. And she raised that card one more time. 34 piglets, sick, undersized, unwanted by every serious farmer in Red Hollow County, and she bought every single one with the last $31 she had on this earth. The crowd laughed. Some of them were still laughing when she loaded those animals into her truck and drove home alone. What they didn't know, what nobody in that county could have imagined, was that those 34 starving piglets were about to turn 2 acres of dead, cracked, worthless dirt into something that would make the whole county go silent. If you're watching this right now and you've ever had someone laugh at your plan, laugh at you, stay until the end, because this story is going to mean something to you. And before we go any further, if you're new here, please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a like if Mara's already got your attention, and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Red Hollow County. The morning of the auction, Mara Whitlock woke up before 4 o'clock, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that she lay there in the dark for almost 20 minutes before she got up, just staring at the ceiling of the small bedroom where she'd slept her entire life, listening to the sound of the old farmhouse settling around her like it was sighing. She had $31. Not $31 until payday. Not $31 in the checking account with more coming on Friday. $31 total. In cash. In a small tin box on the kitchen shelf that used to hold her father's fishing lures before he passed. The farm had 2 acres of pumpkin field that hadn't produced anything worth hauling to market in 2 full seasons. The soil was the color of old ash, pale, cracked, tight as hardpan. And every neighbor she had, every person who'd known her father and respected him, had gently or not so gently suggested that she consider selling the land before it became a pure liability. She hadn't sold. She hadn't been able to make herself do it. Earl Whitlock had worked that field for 31 years. He'd come home with dirt under his fingernails, and a particular kind of tired satisfaction that Mara had spent her whole childhood watching from the porch. When he died 18 months ago, he left her the farm, the debt attached to it, and no instructions whatsoever about what to do when the soil gave out. She got up, pulled on her father's work coat. She'd started wearing it in October after he died and never really stopped, and put on coffee she could barely afford and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the dark field. She had an idea. She'd had it for 3 weeks. Every sensible person she'd floated it past had told her some version of the same thing. Mara, honey, that's not how farming works. Maybe they were right. She drank her coffee. She looked at the field. Then she went and got the tin box. The Red Hollow Livestock Auction ran every second Saturday of the month in a long, loud, smell-heavy barn on the eastern edge of town. Mara had been coming here with her father since she was 8 years old. She knew the layout, knew the auctioneer's cadence, knew which corner got the most morning light, and which pen always smelled worse than the others. She also knew that she didn't belong here today in the way the other farmers did. The Kessler brothers were here with real money and real plans. Dory Fitch from the Southern Ridge had his usual crew, 3 hired hands and a clipboard. And Gideon Rusk, who owned the largest operation in Red Hollow County by a margin that wasn't close, was standing near the premium livestock pens with the comfortable posture of a man who had never once had to count what he spent. Gideon Rusk was not a cruel man in the way that some men are cruel, not openly mean, not given to cruelty for its own sake. But he had a particular talent for making other people feel small without technically saying anything wrong. He was good at tone. He was good at timing. He'd perfected the art of the comment that lands just hard enough to sting but leaves the speaker looking perfectly reasonable. Mara had known him her whole life. He'd bought 2 parcels that bordered her land in the last 4 years. She suspected, though she couldn't prove it, that he was waiting for her to fail completely so he could make an offer on her field. She didn't make eye contact with him when she came in. She found the pen she was looking for near the back. The piglets were not impressive animals. There were 34 of them, crowded together in a way that suggested they found comfort in proximity because they didn't have much else. They were thin, Not the dramatic, photogenic thin of a rescued animal you'd see on a charity poster, but the ordinary, unglamorous thin of animals that had simply not been fed enough for long enough. Their energy was low, their color was off. 3 of them were lying down in the corner and didn't get up when Mara leaned on the pen railing. "You looking at those?" The voice came from beside her, a young auction hand with a clipboard, maybe 19 years old, wearing a county fair t-shirt under his canvas vest. "I am," Mara said. "They've been here 2 weeks," the kid said. "Nobody wants them. Seller dropped the reserve twice. They're going to go for almost nothing if they go at all." "How much is almost nothing?" The kid looked at his clipboard. "Reserve's sitting at $28 for the lot, but I don't think anyone's going to open at reserve." Mara looked at the piglets. One of the ones lying down lifted its head and looked back at her with an expression that communicated absolutely nothing except exhaustion. "Okay," she said quietly, mostly to herself. She wasn't talking to the kid. She was talking to some part of herself that was still arguing, still saying, "This is your last money. This is a terrible idea. You're about to spend everything you have on sick piglets that everyone else passed on, and if this doesn't work, you will have nothing." She knew all of that. She stayed anyway. Well, the bidding on the piglets opened slow. The auctioneer, a compact man named Bertel, who'd been running this auction for 22 years, didn't put much energy into it. He'd seen these animals. He knew the room wasn't excited. Mara opened at 28. There was a pause. Then someone across the ring called 30. Not because they wanted the piglets, Mara realized, but because they recognized her and thought it would be entertaining to make her spend a little more. She went to 31. Silence. "31 going once," Bertel said, and his voice carried the faint sound of a man trying not to editorialize. "31 going twice." That's when Gideon Rusk's voice cut across the barn. It wasn't a bid. He wasn't interested in the piglets either. "Somebody stop that fool woman before she wastes what little she's got left." The words hit the room like a thrown stone hits still water. Not because they were the worst thing anyone had ever said. They weren't. But because of the way the room responded. Because of the little ripple of laughter that moved through the crowd. Not mean, not ugly, but comfortable. The way people laugh when a joke lands and they haven't thought yet about whether they should. Mara felt it land. She felt it the way you feel a cold wind on the back of your neck, suddenly, physically, before you've processed what it is. She did not lower the card. "Sold," said Bertel, and moved immediately to the next lot. Loading the piglets took 45 minutes and tested both Mara's patience and her lower back in ways she hadn't anticipated. The auction hand, the kid with the clipboard, helped her without being asked, which she was grateful for and didn't comment on, because if she commented on it, she'd have to explain why small kindnesses felt so enormous today. She got them loaded. She drove out of the lot. She had $0 left. The truck's gas gauge was sitting at just under a quarter tank, which was fine. It was 11 miles home, but there was something about looking at that gauge that made the whole situation feel suddenly completely real in a way it hadn't before. She had 34 sick piglets in the back of her truck, a 2-acre field of dead soil, a pile of debt that never seemed to get smaller, and $0. She turned onto the county road that led home and drove in silence for a while. The truck made its usual sounds. The piglets were quiet, which she hoped meant they were calm, and not that something was wrong with them. She thought about her father. She thought about the particular way he used to stand at the edge of that field in the early morning, not doing anything, just standing and looking. She'd asked him once what he was doing. "Listening," he'd said. "To what?" "To what the land's got to say today." She'd been 14. She'd thought he was being poetic. Now she wasn't sure. She turned the piglets into the field on a Tuesday afternoon. It wasn't a dramatic moment. There was no crowd. It was just Mara opening the gate in the newly repaired fence. She'd spent 5 days on that fence, salvaging old wire from the barn and a section of rusted railing from the creek property, her hands raw by the end of each day, and stepping back. The piglets came through slowly at first, suspicious, the way underfed animals often are when they're offered something that looks like abundance. Then the first one hit the soil and started rooting. Then another. Then all of them were moving across the cracked earth, snouts down, pushing and churning and breaking apart the hard-panned surface with a thoroughness that surprised her even though she'd planned for it. She stood at the fence and watched. This was the idea. This was the whole idea. Because Mara had read in an old agricultural extension booklet she'd found in her father's things, dated 1987 and dog-eared at exactly the right page, about what pigs do to compacted soil, how they break it open, how their rooting deposits a kind of biological energy into the ground, how the old pumpkin vines, broken down by the animal's rooting, don't just disappear but become part of the soil. How seeds that have been lying dormant, just waiting for the conditions to change, can survive underground for years. 2 seasons of failed harvest. 2 seasons of seeds going into ground that was too hard and too dead to receive them properly. But the seeds hadn't all been collected. Hundreds of them were still down there. The piglets were still rooting. Mara watched for a long time. Then she went inside and ate a dinner of canned soup and crackers, and she did not let herself calculate the odds. Not that night. She'd calculated enough. Word got around Red Hollow County, the way it always does. Through the feed store, through Sunday services, through the particular telephone network of neighbors who aren't malicious, but who are relentlessly curious about each other's business. Calder Boone heard it first through a customer, confirmed it himself by driving past the Whitlock property on Thursday morning, and then told 4 people at his feed store by noon. She put pigs on it, he told them, leaning on the counter with the considered expression of a man who has seen a lot of farming decisions in his time and is ranking this one. 30-some-odd piglets on that dead pumpkin field, bought them at the auction last weekend, spent everything she had. What for? Someone asked. Calder shook his head slowly. That's the question. By the following Saturday, cars were slowing on the county road when they passed her property. Not stopping, just slowing, the way people slow when they pass something that doesn't entirely make sense, that requires a second look to process. The piglets had already changed. 10 days of food, real food, constant access to whatever the field's surface offered, and their bodies were visibly different. They were moving differently too, with more energy, covering more ground each day as they worked further into the field. The soil was changing too. Mara could see it from the fence every morning. The pale, cracked surface she'd inherited was giving way, slowly, section by section, to something darker. The old vine material was breaking apart and pressing into the earth. The surface was losing its concrete quality. She told no one what she was watching for. Calder Boone showed up on a Wednesday, unannounced, the way people in small communities often do when they've decided they're concerned enough to say something. He stood at the fence next to Mara and looked at the field for a moment without speaking. He was 64 years old and had been in agricultural retail for 38 years. He'd seen a lot of land and a lot of farmers make a lot of decisions. Mara, he said, and his voice had a gentleness to it that she recognized as the setup for something she wouldn't want to hear. I've known your family a long time. I know you have, Calder. Your father was a good farmer, a practical man. He was. He gestured at the field. What you're doing here, I don't want to see you go under trying to save land that's already gone. Sometimes soil just gives out. It's not a failure. It just happens. Mara looked at the field. One of the piglets, the largest one, she'd started thinking of him privately as the captain, though she hadn't told anyone that, was working a section near the east fence with particular focus, his snout driving into the earth again and again. I appreciate you coming by, she said. Mara, I do, Calder. I mean it. She turned and looked at him, and something in her expression, not anger, not defiance, just a kind of settled certainty, seemed to stop whatever he'd been about to say next. But I'm not done yet. He left 20 minutes later. He didn't argue further, but he also didn't look convinced. She didn't need him to be convinced. She just needed more time. 3 weeks in, Mara was running on very little sleep, a lot of canned goods, and a particular kind of stubbornness that she was beginning to suspect she'd inherited along with the farm. Her hands had blisters that had hardened into calluses. Her back had a persistent ache in the lower left that she'd decided to simply accept rather than address. She woke every morning before 5, walked the perimeter of the field, checked the water situation, checked the animals, stood at the fence for exactly as long as it took her to understand how things stood, and then went back inside to figure out the rest of the day. She wasn't thinking about what she'd do if this didn't work. She'd made a deliberate decision not to think about that, not because she was naive about the odds, but because she'd found, in the last 18 months since her father died, that her brain had a tendency to disappear entirely into the what if it fails space if she gave it any opening, and it wasn't useful there. It didn't solve anything. It just made her stand in the kitchen at 2 in the morning eating crackers and feeling the full weight of everything she stood to lose. So she kept the door on that room closed. Not locked, just closed. The piglets were eating well now. Their ribs were less visible. The three that had been lying down in the corner of the auction pen were all reliably on their feet. The soil in the sections they'd worked longest was noticeably different from the sections they hadn't reached yet, darker, looser. She'd put her hand into it one morning and felt actual give, actual moisture, held in the earth, instead of the crumbling dry resistance she'd gotten used to. She was still waiting for the thing she was actually watching for. Then, on a morning in early June, when the light was still low and golden, and the captain was working a section of soil about 20 feet from where she stood at the fence, Mara saw it. A thin green thread, barely visible, pushing up through the dark surface of the earth. Then another one, 6 inches to its left. Then a third. She stared at them for a long moment. Her throat did something complicated. She put her hand on the top rail of the fence and held on. Pumpkin seedlings. The seeds that had been in the ground for 2 years, waiting in soil that was never right for them, were pushing up through earth that finally was. She did not cry. She pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose and kept hold of the fence rail. After a while, she straightened up and looked at the entire field. 34 animals moving through it, the surface dark and alive from the fence to the far tree line. And she felt something she hadn't let herself feel in a very long time. Not certainty, not triumph. Just a quiet, deep, bone-level sense that the ground beneath her was not lost. That it had been waiting. That it had always been capable of exactly this. Those seedlings didn't disappear overnight the way Mara had half feared they would. The way good things sometimes do when you're not sure you can trust them yet. They stayed. They pushed higher. And 3 days after she'd first spotted that thin green thread near the east fence, there were dozens of them scattered across the sections. The piglets had worked longest and deepest, rising out of the dark turned soil like something that had been holding its breath for a very long time and had finally decided it was safe to exhale. Mara counted 37 distinct seedlings on a Thursday morning in early June. She wasn't counting for any particular reason. She just needed to do something with her hands while her mind processed what her eyes were telling her. She stopped counting at 37 because she ran out of easily visible ones, not because there weren't more. The captain was working the northwest corner, which was the last major section of soil still showing the old, pale, cracked surface, and she watched him for a while. The methodical, uncelebrated work of an animal that had no idea it was doing something important. He was just eating, just rooting, just doing the thing his body was built to do. And the earth was opening up under him the way earth does when something finally comes along that it needed. She went inside and ate half a can of black beans cold, standing over the kitchen sink because she'd forgotten to turn on the stove. The thing about small county gossip is that it doesn't require malice to become a problem. It just requires repetition. By the second week of June, the narrative that had formed around Mara Whitlock and her piglets was already hardened into a specific shape, the shape of a story people had decided they knew the ending of. She was the woman who'd panicked after 2 bad harvests and made an emotional decision with her last dollar. She was the daughter trying to honor a dead father's land past the point where honoring it made sense. She was, depending on who you asked, either pitiable or foolish or both. And the distinction between those two things didn't seem to matter much to the people making the assessment. She heard versions of this when she went to Calder Boone's feed store for a box of salt blocks and a spool of fencing wire she'd been putting off buying. She heard it not because anyone said it directly to her face. Red Hollow County people were too practiced in courtesy for that, but because conversation changed shape when she walked in. Got slightly brighter and slightly less specific. The kind of change that tells you exactly what was being said before you arrived. Calder himself came out from behind the counter to help her find the wire gauge she needed, which was kind of him, and he didn't say anything about the field or the piglets. He asked about the fence repairs and whether the old well on the east side of the property was still holding. "It's holding," Mara said. "Good, that's good." He set the wire spool on the counter. "You need anything else while you're in?" She thought about saying something. She thought about telling him what she'd seen 3 mornings ago, what she was still seeing every morning. More seedlings, the soil continuing to change, the piglets filling out in ways that were becoming hard to ignore. She thought about describing the captain's work on the northwest corner and how the soil there was already starting to shift color. She didn't say any of it. "Just these," she said, and paid with the last of the small emergency fund she'd been protecting like it was made of something more valuable than paper. On her way out, she passed Dory Fitch coming in. He held the door for her, genuinely, without calculation, and then said, quietly enough that it felt almost private, "How's the field coming, Mara?" She looked at him. Dory Fitch was not a bad man. He was just a man who'd already written her story in his head and was asking out of something between politeness and morbid curiosity. "It's coming," she said, and walked to her truck. She sat in the parking lot for a moment before starting the engine. Not because she was upset, she wasn't exactly, but because she needed a second to let the weight of other people's certainty slide off her before she drove home. It had a particular texture, that weight. It wasn't anger, it was heavier than anger. It was the weight of being seen as already finished when you know, in your body, in the place where certainty lives below words, that you are nowhere near done. She started the truck and drove home. The problem she hadn't fully solved, hadn't let herself fully think about yet, was water. June in Red Hollow County could go two ways. It could give you the measured, regular rainfall that made farming feel like it made sense. Or it could do what it was increasingly tending to do in recent years, deliver 3 or 4 good inches in the first week, and then pull back into a dry, glaring heat that lasted until August and made the fields look like they were slowly giving up. The seedlings needed water. The soil the piglets had worked open was good now, genuinely good in a way that still surprised Mara when she put her hand into it each morning, loose and dark, and holding moisture better than she'd dared hope. But holding moisture wasn't the same as having enough of it. And the well on the east side of the property, the one Calder had asked about, was reliable but not deep. It had limits. She spent 2 evenings doing the math on paper at the kitchen table. It wasn't the kind of math that led to comfortable conclusions. She had the well. She had an old irrigation line that ran along the north fence, but had 2 breaks in it she'd been patching with rubber and wire, and she had whatever rainfall June decided to provide. What she did not have was money for additional equipment, hose, pipe fittings, or the luxury of error. She fixed the irrigation line on a Saturday, lying on her stomach in the dirt for most of the afternoon working on the second break, which was in an awkward position near a fence post and required her to use a wrench at an angle that guaranteed she'd feel it in her shoulder for the next 4 days. The first break had been simpler. A clean split she could patch with a sleeve coupling and a little patience. The second one was ragged and required her to cut out a full section and splice in a new piece, which used up more than half the spare line she had in the barn. When she finished, she ran the line and stood watching water move through the irrigation system across the north section of the field. It worked. Not perfectly. There was a slow drip at one of the sleeve couplings she'd wrapped twice with waterproof tape, but it moved water where she needed water to go. She let out a long breath and stood up, and felt every one of her 34 years in her spine. The captain, working nearby, ignored her entirely. He was busy. Gideon Rusk drove past the property on a Tuesday morning and slowed his truck the way people had been doing since word got around. But unlike most of them, he stopped. He pulled completely off the road and sat there for a moment with his engine running and his window down, looking at the field from the road. Mara saw him from the fence. She was doing her morning perimeter check, and his truck was hard to miss. It was newer than anything else on the county road, and cleaner in a way that suggested it had never been parked on unpaved ground. She didn't walk toward him. She continued her perimeter check, moving along the south fence line, aware of him the way you're aware of something at the edge of your peripheral vision that you've decided not to give the satisfaction of a direct look. He sat there for maybe 3 minutes. Then he pulled back onto the road and drove away. She didn't let herself interpret it. She didn't let herself feel the particular cold unease that Gideon Rusk's attention tended to produce, the sense that his interest in her property was never entirely casual. She had enough to think about. She moved on to the east fence line and finished her check. By the time she got back to the gate, there were 42 seedlings she could count from where she stood. 42 and still coming. The first person who came to the fence without an agenda, without concern or curiosity, shaped like concern, without the particular edge of someone waiting to see you fail, was a woman named Patrice Delgado, who lived 4 miles down the road and raised chickens, and in good years, a small market garden. She pulled up one morning in mid-June in her ancient white pickup that had a cracked headlight and a bumper sticker from a county fair 5 years ago, and she leaned out the window and called across the ditch. "Are those pumpkin seedlings?" Mara was at the fence. She turned. "They are." Patrice Delgado stared at the field for a moment. She was in her early 50s, a practical, weather-read woman who didn't say things she didn't mean. "How many?" "Lot of them," Mara said. "Getting more every day." Patrice was quiet for a moment, then, "You got those piglets from the auction." "I did." "The skinny ones nobody wanted." "Those are the ones." Another pause. Then Patrice laughed. Not the uncomfortable crowd-following laugh from the auction barn, but a real one, short and genuine and surprised. "Well," she said, "how about that?" She drove on without saying anything else. But she'd said enough. It was the first time anyone had looked at what Mara was doing and responded with something other than pity or amusement, and it settled into her chest and stayed there in a way she hadn't expected and was grateful for. By the third week of June, the seedlings had become vines. Not mature vines, not yet, but actual running growth, green and purposeful, spreading out from the original seedling clusters across the worked soil in the unhurried but insistent way that pumpkin vines move when conditions suit them. Mara had seen this field in good years when her father was alive, and she knew what pumpkin growth looked like when it was right. This was right. The vines were dark-stemmed and healthy at the node points, and the leaves were a good deep green without the yellowish tinge that indicated trouble. The piglets had reached the northwest corner and turned back, now working a second pass through the central section, their rooting less frantic than it had been in the first weeks. They were well fed now, doing this out of habit and instinct rather than desperation, and Mara had begun to think seriously about when she would need to move them out of the field before they began damaging the vines they'd helped create. That calculation kept her up on a Tuesday night. Too early, and she'd lose the soil working benefit in the sections they hadn't fully covered. Too late, and she'd start losing vines. She lay in the dark working through it in her head without a notepad, which was always a mistake because the numbers got slippery, and eventually she got up and worked through it at the kitchen table with a pencil stub in the back of an envelope. She settled on the last week of June. She'd need the old South Pen repaired and ready before then. That meant 4 days of work she hadn't scheduled. She wrote it down and went back to bed. She slept poorly, but she slept. The conversation with Calder Boone that she hadn't had in the feed store happened anyway, just not where she'd expected it. He came out to the property on a Friday afternoon, which she hadn't invited but also hadn't been surprised by. Calder was the kind of man who processed things at his own pace and then showed up when he'd gotten there. He drove his old blue sedan down her access road and parked it near the barn and walked to the fence where Mara was working on a section of post that had started to lean. He looked at the field for a long time. The vines were visible from where they stood, clearly visible, clearly healthy, covering a substantial portion of the worked ground and still spreading. The piglets moved through them without disturbing them, which would change soon, which was why Mara was trying to get the South Pen ready, but for now the whole field had a quality that Calder seemed to be struggling to categorize. "You knew," he said finally, not accusatory, just processing. "I hoped," Mara said. She drove a post anchor deeper with a mallet. "There's a difference." The seeds were still in the ground. "The seeds were always in the ground, Calder. The soil just wasn't in any shape to let them do anything." She paused on the mallet. "You compact pumpkin soil hard enough for long enough and nothing's getting through. But the seeds don't die just because the surface is bad. They wait." Calder was quiet. "The pigs broke it open," Mara said, "and fed it, and the seeds did the rest." She went back to the post anchor. "That's the whole thing. That's all it was." "The whole thing," Calder repeated, and something in his voice suggested he was finding this simultaneously simpler and more complicated than he'd expected. "You bet your last $31 on that." "I did." "And if the seeds had been dead?" She looked at him. "Then I'd have been in a much worse situation than I'm in now, and you'd be having a different conversation with me." He almost smiled. "I came by to tell you I should have kept my mouth shut when I was here before." "You were being kind," Mara said. "I know the difference." "I was being certain about something I didn't know enough to be certain about." She considered this, drove the anchor one more time. "Most people are. It's not a character flaw, Calder. It's just how things look from outside." He stayed another half hour, helped her muscle a new brace rail into position without being asked, and left without saying much else. But he looked at the field one more time before he got in his car, the way you look at something that has refiled itself in your understanding, that now belongs in a different category than the one you'd placed it in. Mara watched him drive out. Then she went back to work on the fence. The vines kept moving. By the end of June, when Mara moved the piglets into the newly repaired south pen, a process that took 4 hours and tested her patience in ways she would not have believed possible before she'd spent 6 weeks learning each animal's particular personality. The field had transformed enough to be visible from the road in a way that stopped people without requiring them to slow down first. The green was just there, undeniable from 40 feet away. Moving the piglets was the hardest physical day she'd had since she'd first repaired the north fence, and that was saying something. The captain, predictably, was the most resistant. He had decided that the field was his domain, and he had opinions about the south pen that he communicated through sheer immovable weight and a particular sideways movement that kept redirecting him away from the gate every time Mara thought she had him going through it. She spent 45 minutes on just the captain. "Come on," she told him, for the 8th time, in a voice that had completely abandoned any pretense of being patient. "I'm not asking, I'm telling. Get in the pen." The captain looked at her with the expression of an animal that had decided she was not actually in charge of this situation. She got behind him and pushed. He moved sideways. She said something her father would have raised an eyebrow at, repositioned herself, and tried again. Eventually, because she was more stubborn than he was, and she had the fence working in her favor, he went through. She latched the gate behind him with more force than strictly necessary and stood there breathing for a moment with her hands on her knees. The captain walked calmly to the far corner of the south pen and began investigating it with the focused energy of an animal that had already moved on and had no feelings about any of it. "Fine," Mara said. "Fine." July came in dry. Not the dramatic, headline-making dry of a true agricultural emergency. Not the kind that produced disaster declarations in county meetings and emergency water allocations. Just the ordinary, grinding dry of a summer that had decided it was done being cooperative. The early rains had been decent, better than she'd feared, and the soil the piglets had worked had held that moisture longer than she'd dared hope, which told her something important about the difference between dead compacted earth and genuinely restored ground. But by the second week of July, she was running the irrigation line every other day and watching the well levels with the particular attention of someone who understands that what they're watching is a resource with a finite bottom. The pumpkins were setting fruit. That was the word that came to her mind. Setting. The blossoms had been coming since the last days of June, yellow, open, busy with the bees that showed up without invitation and that she had privately decided to feel grateful for rather than surprised by. And now, beneath the spent blossoms, where the stem met the vine, small round shapes were beginning to define themselves. Still green, still small, still weeks away from anything she could put on a wagon. But they were there, undeniably, documentably, stubbornly there. She checked them every morning. She did not touch them. She just looked, and counted the ones she could see from the perimeter path, and went back inside and ate whatever she had, and thought about water. The well held. She wasn't certain it would keep holding. She added it to the list of things she was choosing not to spend energy catastrophizing about, a list that had gotten quite long over the past 6 weeks, and she moved on. Gideon Russ came back, not driving past this time. He pulled down the access road in the middle of a weekday morning and parked near the barn and got out of his truck and stood there for a moment as if he was waiting for her to come out, which she did. She'd seen him from the kitchen window and given herself exactly 10 seconds to decide how to handle it, which wasn't enough time to decide much, so she just walked out. He was looking at the field when she came around the corner of the barn. He didn't turn immediately. He just kept looking. She stopped a few feet from him and waited. "Well," he said, still not turning, "you've got vines." "I've got vines," she said. Now he turned. Gideon Rusk was in his mid-60s, tanned and square-faced, with the kind of permanent squint that came from 40 years of working in open fields. He didn't look unkind up close. That was the thing about him that had always made his comments harder to dismiss than they deserved to be. He looked like a reasonable man. He usually sounded like one too. "How?" he said. It wasn't mocking, it was a real question. Seeds were still in the ground, Mara said. Soil needed to be worked open. The pigs did that. He looked at her for a moment. You figured that out from what? Something you read? Something my father had. Old extension booklet. Your father? He said it with something that wasn't quite sentiment, but wasn't nothing either. He'd known Earl Whitlock. They hadn't been close, but they'd known each other the way men who farm adjacent territory know each other, through proximity and occasional need. Yeah, Mara said. Gideon looked back at the field. The vines covered most of it now, thick and running, with the small green pumpkins visible on the stems if you knew where to look. He seemed to be working something out in his head, some recalculation of a situation he thought he'd understood. I said something at the auction, he said. You did. I wasn't... He stopped, started again. I wasn't trying to make it hard for you. Mara looked at him steadily. You made it easier for people to laugh, she said. Not heated, just factual. Whether you were trying to or not, that's what it did. He held her look. Something shifted in his jaw. That's fair, he said. She hadn't expected him to say that. She didn't let it show. I've been watching this property for a while, he said, and now his voice had shifted into something more careful. You know that. I know. I want you to know I won't be making any offers on it, if that's been in the back of your mind. She studied him. Is that because you've decided I'm not selling, or because you've decided the land's worth more than you thought? The corner of his mouth moved, almost a smile. Both, probably. He turned toward his truck. Your pumpkins will be ready in what, August? Early September, I'd guess, if the water holds. The water? He nodded slowly, like that was the part he would have worried about too. You need anything for that? She felt the pull of it, the practical material pull of what he was offering, which was real and would solve the most pressing problem she had right now. She felt it, and she weighed it. I'm managing, she said. He opened his truck door. All right. He got in. Then, before he closed it, your father would have liked this, the whole thing. He'd always believed that land tells you what it needs if you're patient enough to hear it. He closed the door and backed out of the access road without another word. Mara stood where she was until the truck reached the county road and turned north and disappeared. She stood there a little longer. Then she walked back to the barn and got back to work, because there was always more work, and because standing still thinking about Gideon Rusk's version of her father was not something she could afford to do for more than about 30 seconds without it pulling her somewhere she didn't need to go right now. The dry spell broke on a Saturday night in mid-July, which was later than she'd have chosen and earlier than she'd feared. She heard it before she saw it, that particular change in the air pressure and the sound of wind moving through the old oaks along the north fence line, shifting into something heavier. And she was standing on the porch watching the sky when the first drops came down, big and spaced, and then suddenly not spaced at all. She stayed on the porch and got wet and did not go inside. The rain came for 4 hours. Not violent, no hail, no dangerous winds, just a long, steady, honest soaking rain that moved across the field and went into the earth at the rate that good, worked, open soil accepts water, which is faster than compacted ground and slower than bare clay. She could hear it. She could hear the difference in how it landed. By midnight, it had slowed to a drizzle and then stopped. The field smelled the way fields smell after rain, but richer than she remembered it smelling before. Darker and more alive. The smell of soil that had something in it worth feeding. She went inside and slept for 7 hours without interruption, which was the longest sleep she'd had since May. She woke up to a field she already knew had changed overnight, even before she walked to the fence to see it, because she could feel it the way you feel things when you've been paying close attention to something for long enough that you stop needing to see it directly to know what's happening with it. The pumpkins on the vine were bigger. Not dramatically, not overnight miracle bigger, just visibly, measurably, undeniably bigger in the way that makes you realize they'd been waiting for exactly this. This one good rain at exactly this point in their development, and that it had arrived at precisely the moment it needed to. She stood at the fence and looked at them for a long time. She thought about the seeds. She thought about 2 years of waiting underground in soil that was too dead to let them move. She thought about 34 sick piglets in the corner of an auction pen that nobody wanted, and $31, and a crowd that was still laughing when she drove out of the parking lot. She thought about her father standing at the edge of this field in the early morning, not doing anything, just listening. She pressed her hand into the soil near the fence post. It gave under her palm, warm and dark and alive, holding the rain from the night before with an ease that would have seemed impossible 3 months ago when it was pale and cracked and sealed shut against anything trying to grow in it. She stayed like that for a while, hand in the dirt, just feeling it. The captain was making noise from the south pen, his usual morning announcement that he was awake and had opinions about breakfast. The other piglets joined in one by one until the sound was a full chorus of animals that were healthy and loud and entirely unaware that they had done something important. Mara pulled her hand out of the soil and brushed it clean on the knee of her father's coat. She walked to the south pen and fed them. Then she came back and stood at the field one more time and looked at what July had become on land that everyone in Red Hollow County had already finished mourning, on a farm they'd already written off, tended by a woman they'd already decided had made a sentimental, irreversible mistake. The pumpkins were still small. They had weeks to go. There was still the question of water, and the question of market timing, and the question of a dozen other things that could still go wrong between now and harvest. She knew all of that. But the field was alive, and the vines were running, and the green shapes on the stems were getting bigger every day, and nobody who had driven past this property in the last 2 weeks had driven past without slowing down. That was enough for now. That was exactly enough. The pumpkins kept growing. That sounds simple when you say it that way, and in one sense it was biology doing what biology does when you finally give it the conditions it needs. But Mara had spent enough time with failing crops to understand that kept growing was not a small thing. Keeping was the hard part. Starting was the dramatic part, the part people noticed and talked about. Keeping required something quieter and more sustained, something that didn't photograph well and didn't make for good conversation at the feed store. And it asked that of the farmer just as much as it asked it of the plants. She was out there every morning before the heat built, moving along the vine rows with the careful attention of someone who has learned that the difference between a good harvest and a lost one is often something you can see 3 weeks before it becomes a problem if you're paying close enough attention. She was looking for the pale underside of a leaf that indicated mite pressure. She was looking for the soft spots at the stem base that meant rot had found its way in. She was looking for the particular dull color that meant a vine was pulling more water than the root system could deliver. She found problems. That was the thing nobody told you about a recovering field. It didn't recover all at once or all evenly. The northeast quadrant, which had been the last area the piglets worked and therefore had the least preparation time before the seeds came up, was showing slower vine development, and a couple of the pumpkins on those stems were sitting at a size that should have moved past by now. She spent 2 mornings adjusting the irrigation line to give that quadrant more attention and watched the vines carefully for a week afterward. They responded, slowly, incompletely, in the way plants respond when you've caught something late rather than early. Not the enthusiastic response of a well-tended plant, but the grudging stabilization of one that's been under stress and is deciding whether to push through or surrender. 3 of the pumpkins in that quadrant stayed small. She accepted that. You cannot save everything, and spending effort trying to save what won't be saved is how you lose what will. She was not sentimental about it. She had her father's practicality in her. The part that understood farming was a negotiation with conditions you couldn't control, and that the negotiation required you to be clear-eyed about what was and wasn't within your influence. What was within her influence was water management, pest monitoring, and the structural integrity of the vines in the central sections, which were producing the pumpkins she was increasingly certain about. Those centerfield plants, growing in the soil the piglets had worked earliest and longest, were doing something she hadn't let herself fully believe in until now. They were producing large. Not large in the way of a specialty bred variety specifically selected for size. She hadn't planted specialty seeds. The seeds in the ground were the same standard field variety her father had always grown, but large in the way that happens when soil is genuinely right and water is genuinely adequate, and the plant is under no stress that it can't manage on its own. She didn't measure them. She told herself she wasn't measuring because she didn't want to develop an attachment to specific numbers that the last weeks before harvest could still change. The truth, which she acknowledged at about 2 in the morning on a Thursday when she couldn't sleep, was that she was afraid to measure them because the numbers would make it real in a way that made it possible to lose, and she wasn't ready for that kind of vulnerability yet. She went back to sleep without measuring them. She felt no particular resolution about this. It was just something she was doing. Patrice Delgado came back in late July, and this time she stopped the truck and got out. She walked to the fence and stood next to Mara, and they both looked at the field for a while without saying much. The vines by now covered the full 2 acres in a density that had surprised Mara herself the first time she'd seen it from the road. Not from inside the property, which she was used to, but from the county road looking in, the way everyone else saw it, and the view from outside was different. From outside, the field looked like a deliberate act. From outside, it looked like something someone had planned and executed with confidence. From inside, it had always felt like one continuous improvisation held together with baling wire and stubbornness. "Those are going to be big," Patrice said. She wasn't asking. "Some of them," Mara said. "The northeast corner's been slower. But those center ones." "Yeah." Patrice was quiet for another moment. She had her arms crossed over the top fence rail, chin resting on her forearms, looking out at the field with an expression that Mara had begun to recognize, the expression of a practical person recalibrating something they thought they'd understood. "Can I ask you something?" Patrice said. "Sure." "When you bought those piglets," she paused, "did you know? Or were you hoping?" Mara considered this. It was a better question than most people had asked her, because it made the distinction that most people hadn't bothered to make. "I knew the soil needed to be broken up and fed. I knew pigs do that. I knew seeds can survive dormant for a few years in the right conditions." She stopped. "Whether the seeds in this particular field were still viable after 2 years, that I didn't know. I was hoping." "That's a big gap," Patrice said, "between what you knew and what you were hoping." "It was $31 in a dead field," Mara said. The gap felt manageable. Patrice laughed, the same short, genuine laugh from before. "Manageable." She shook her head slowly. "You know what the difference is between you and most people in this county, Mara? I'd rather not assume. Most people needed to know before they moved. You moved and then found out." Patrice straightened up from the fence. "Your dad was like that. Not many people are." She got back in her truck and drove away, and Mara stood at the fence thinking about that, about whether it was a compliment or a clinical observation or both, and eventually decided it was both, and that Patrice Delgado was one of those people who was more perceptive than she advertised. The heat got serious in the first week of August. Not unprecedented heat, not record-breaking, not emergency level, just the ordinary punishing heat of a red hollow, August, that settled over the county like something with weight and intent. The kind of heat that makes the air shimmer off the county road at noon and dries the grass along the fence lines to a pale, crisp yellow and makes the shadows feel like something you could sell. Mara restructured her days around it. She was out before 6, working the field and checking the irrigation during the cooler morning hours. She was inside during the worst of the midday heat, using the time for the maintenance and repair work she could do in the barn or on the porch, mending a section of chicken wire on the south pen where the captain had been testing the perimeter with methodical persistence, fixing the handle on a broken hoe, patching the knee of her work pants for the 3rd time because she couldn't afford a new pair and they still had life in them. She went back out in the late afternoon when the worst of it had broken, and she stayed until the light got low and the temperature dropped into something bearable, and then she went inside and ate whatever she had, and did the water math for the next day, and went to bed. She was tired in a way that had become structural, not the acute tired of a single hard day, but the chronic, load-bearing tired of someone who had been running at this pace for months without a real break, without a day where nothing needed doing, without a single morning where she'd woken up without immediately starting to calculate what the day required. She didn't complain about it. There was no one to complain to, and she wasn't sure she would have anyway. Her father had treated exhaustion as a weather condition, something you acknowledged and moved through, not something you dramatized. She'd absorbed that from him the way children absorb things from their parents, without noticing it happening, and she found it useful now, even when some quieter part of her wished she had someone to sit on the porch with at the end of the day and just be tired at, without it meaning anything, without it requiring a plan. The South Pen had become a kind of evening ritual. After dinner, she'd walk down and lean on the railing for a while, and the piglets, the 34 of them now genuinely transformed from the thin, uncertain animals she'd loaded at the auction, would come over or not, depending on their mood. The captain usually came over. He developed the habit of putting his snout against the fence rail near her hand, not with affection exactly, but with a kind of stubborn familiarity that was as close to affection as she suspected he was capable of. She talked to him sometimes. Not in the animated, sentimental way people talk to pets in movies, but in the low, half-formed way you talk when you're thinking out loud, and the audience doesn't need to understand and won't judge you. "Water's going to be tight this week," she told him one evening. He pressed his snout against the rail. "Northeast corner's still behind. 3 of those pumpkins aren't going to make it to sellable size. I've made my peace with that." She looked at the field, just barely visible from where she stood in the fading light, the vines a dark mass against the darkening earth. "But the center rows are going to be something." The captain moved away. He'd heard enough or lost interest or both. "Right," Mara said, and went inside. The second week of August brought a development she hadn't anticipated, which in retrospect she should have. She'd been so focused on the internal challenges of the field that she'd underestimated how much attention the visible transformation had generated in the county. A man named Fletcher Cade showed up at the end of her access road on a Wednesday morning. Fletcher Cade worked for the County Agricultural Extension Office, which still existed in an underfunded, reduced staff form, and he drove a gray sedan with a small county seal on the door and wore a short-sleeved button shirt that suggested he spent most of his time in an office and not in a field. Mara was repairing a vine support stake in the center section when she saw him walking down the access road toward her. She straightened up and watched him come. He introduced himself carefully, the way people who work for government offices introduce themselves: full name, title, purpose of visit, and explained that he'd been hearing about the field and had wanted to see it for himself, if she didn't mind. Several farmers had mentioned it. There was some interest, he said carefully, in understanding what she'd done and whether it had applications for other degraded agricultural land in the county. Mara looked at him for a moment. "Applications," she said. "For soil remediation," he said, "using animal activity to break up compaction and restore organic matter. It's not a new concept theoretically, but seeing it executed at this scale, in this soil type." He paused and looked at the field with the expression of someone who had come expecting to be politely interested and was now genuinely interested. "It's working better than I would have predicted. Pig tillage has been written about since at least the 80s, Mara said. She wasn't trying to be difficult. She was just being precise, which was a habit she'd gotten from her father, who had no patience for the suggestion that things he'd known for years were newer than they were. "It has," Fletcher Cade agreed. "The execution is the harder part." She showed him around, not because she was particularly inclined to. She had work to do, and this was not how she'd planned to spend the morning, but because she could see that his interest was genuine rather than procedural. And genuine interest was something she'd had little enough of from other people that she found herself willing to spend time on it when it appeared. She walked him through the perimeter, explained the irrigation adjustment she'd made for the northeast quadrant, showed him the difference in vine development between the earliest worked sections and the last ones. She showed him the 3 pumpkins she'd written off in the northeast corner and explained why she'd made that call. She showed him the center rows. He stopped in front of one of the larger pumpkins in the center section, crouched down, and looked at it for a long moment without speaking. It was the size of a large watermelon. Dark orange had begun coming up from the base. The stem was thick and clean. The vine it sat on was as healthy a pumpkin vine as Mara had ever seen grow in this field. "How much do you think that weighs?" he said. "Not ready to guess yet," Mara said. "Still a month out." He stood up. "Can I come back in September?" "For what purpose?" "To document it, take some measurements, talk to you about the process in more detail." He looked at her directly. "There are 4 other farms in this county with soil degradation comparable to what yours was. 3 of them are at the point where the owners are seriously considering abandoning them. If what you've done here is replicable, it's replicable," she said. Not defensively, just factually. He nodded. "Then it matters. Beyond just your farm." She thought about it, decided that being documented and being invaded were different things, and she could maintain the difference. "September," she said, "after harvest." "Thank you." He started walking back toward the access road, then stopped and turned. "One more question." "Sure." "The pigs. Where did you get the idea for that specifically? For using that particular mechanism for that particular soil problem?" "Old extension booklet," Mara said. "My father had it." Fletcher Cade looked at her for a moment with an expression that was harder to read. Then he said, "The Extension Office published those. In the 80s. Before the budget cuts." Something in his voice suggested that he found this both satisfying and sad. Good to know one of them mattered. He left. Mara watched the gray sedan back out to the county road. Then she went back to the vine support stake she'd been working on when he arrived. It had been loose for 4 days, and she'd been getting to it around everything else, which was the story of everything on this farm. She tightened the stake and moved on. The color change started in mid-August. She'd been watching for it without naming it, the way you watch for something you want so badly that naming it feels like tempting some mechanism of disappointment. But there it was, the deep green of the largest pumpkins beginning to shift at the base, a warmth coming up from the bottom, a migration from green toward the color that was the whole point, had always been the whole point, of everything she'd done since March. Orange, coming slow and real and undeniable from the bottom of the fruit, the way color comes when it means it. Not all of them. The northeast corner pumpkins stayed stubbornly green and small, and she'd made her peace with those, as she'd told the captain that evening. But the center rose, and the south section, which had surprised her by performing nearly as well as the center, were changing. Several dozen pumpkins, most of them large, some of them larger than anything she could remember this field producing even in her father's best years, were beginning to turn. She stood in the center row on an August morning, and she looked at what 2 acres of dead soil had become, and she felt the complicated, unwieldy thing that she'd been keeping managed and contained for months begin to move in her chest with a force she hadn't prepared herself for. She pressed her back teeth together and breathed through her nose and stood there until it settled. She was not going to cry in the middle of a pumpkin field at 7 in the morning. She had work to do. There was an irrigation adjustment needed at the north line and the south pen fence where the captain kept testing the wire, and the wagon running gear she needed to check before she'd need it in earnest. She had a lot to do. She turned around and got started. The wagon. The wagon was a problem she'd been aware of abstractly for weeks and was now required to be aware of concretely because harvest was no longer theoretical. The farm had 2 wagons. One her father had rebuilt himself about 12 years ago, which was in serviceable condition, and one that had been sitting on the north side of the barn since before Mara could remember, and had 3 broken boards in the bed and a wheel that needed repacking and a hitch assembly that she was not entirely confident about. She needed both. She rebuilt the second wagon bed over 3 days using lumber she had, which was not quite the right lumber. It was boards left over from the barn repair she'd done 2 winters ago, a half-inch thinner than ideal and not pressure-treated, which meant they would not have a long life as wagon bed boards, but would serve for a harvest season. And she worked the wheel bearing and repacked it with grease from the barn shelf. And she took apart the hitch assembly piece by piece, examined everything, replaced 2 bolts that she didn't like the look of, and put it back together. The wagon held. She tested it with 200 pounds of scrap iron from behind the barn, hauled it in a circle around the property, watched the wheel, listened for anything wrong. It was not a beautiful wagon, it was a functional one. That was enough. Word had gotten serious by late August. Not just the occasional car slowing on the county road, that had been happening for weeks. Now people were stopping, pulling over, getting out and standing at the road's edge, looking at the field the way you look at something that has required you to change your mind about what's possible. Mara noticed it without engaging with it much. She had too much to do. The pumpkins were close. She could feel it in the weight of the largest ones when she pressed her hand against them, in the quality of the color, in the way the vines at the stem attachment points were beginning to show the first signs of the natural dying back that preceded full ripeness. She was watching all of it simultaneously, running her own timing estimates in parallel with the weather forecast she got from the radio each evening, trying to land the harvest in the window between ready and overripe, and before the first frost risk, which in Red Hollow County started creeping in around the second week of September. She was aiming for the first Saturday of September. The county market ran on Saturdays, had run on Saturdays her entire life, and she needed the market because selling at the field was not going to work. She'd get visitors, and she'd get lowball offers, and she'd get neighbors with opinions, and she was not interested in any of that. She wanted to load the wagons and go to market and sell pumpkins the way her father had sold pumpkins, at the public stand, on public scales, at market price. She told no one her timeline. She told no one how many she was expecting to harvest, or what she thought they'd weigh, or what she thought they'd bring at market price. She had not earned the right to say those numbers out loud yet. Harvest was not done until it was done. She had watched enough farming to know that the last week could take things from you that the whole season had built. She was careful. She was watchful. She was so tired by the last days of August that she was making small, stupid errors, putting tools down in the wrong places, forgetting things in the barn she'd gone to retrieve, starting one task and then discovering she'd begun another without finishing the first. The kind of errors that come from running too long on too little sleep and too much sustained vigilance. She gave herself one full night of uninterrupted sleep by the simple method of going to bed at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday, something she hadn't done since she was a child. She woke at 4:30 feeling nearly human. It wasn't enough to balance the accumulated deficit, but it was enough to function well for the next several days, which was all she was asking for. She walked the field in the early darkness of that Wednesday morning with a flashlight, moving through the center rows and the south section, checking each large pumpkin in turn, pressing her thumb against the skin to feel the firmness, looking at where the orange had reached on each one. 3/4 of them were ready or within days of ready. The remaining quarter were close. A few of the south section pumpkins she'd have to cut a day or two before ideal, but close enough. The center rows, the ones she'd been watching longest, the ones growing in the earliest worked soil, the ones from seeds that had been waiting underground for 2 full years, were ready. The largest one, sitting on a vine near the middle of the center section, had a stem the diameter of her wrist in color from top to bottom without a trace of green remaining, and when she pressed her hand against its side, the firmness was what she'd been waiting for. She turned off the flashlight and stood in the dark field for a moment. She could hear the south pen, the captain, doing his 4 in the morning thing, moving around, expressing his ongoing dissatisfaction with the concept of night. She could hear the oaks along the north fence moving in a small, cool wind that had come in from the northwest. She could hear the field itself, or what she imagined as the field itself, the low, alive hum of a place that had been given back something it had lost. She told her father once, years ago, that she didn't understand what he meant when he said he was listening to the land. She understood it now. She didn't have words for it that wouldn't sound foolish to anyone who hadn't stood in a dark field after a long season. But she understood what he'd meant. You got quiet enough, and you paid enough sustained attention, and the land told you things, not in language, just in the particular quality of being there, in the way it felt under your feet and in the air above it. This land was telling her it was ready. She turned the flashlight back on and walked back toward the barn. Harvest was in 4 days. She had wagons to check and market logistics to figure out, and one more pass of irrigation to run on the northeast corner and 100 other things to do before Saturday morning. She went back to work. The Thursday before harvest, something happened that she hadn't planned for and couldn't have. She was at the barn checking the wagon hitch for the 3rd time. She was aware this was excessive, but she kept finding reasons to check it again. When she heard tires on the access road, she came around the barn corner expecting Patrice or Fletcher Cade, or possibly another slow down and stop curiosity visit from someone she knew, and instead it was a truck she didn't immediately recognize, and when the driver got out she needed a moment to place him. Tommy Whitlock, her cousin, her father's brother's son. She hadn't seen him in 3 years. He was 41 years old and had their family's particular jaw and posture, and he stood by his truck with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the field with an expression she couldn't fully read. "Tommy," she said. "Mara." He looked at her. He had the slightly complicated expression of someone who isn't sure of their reception. "I heard you've done something with the field." "You heard right. I came to see it." He paused. "And to see you. It's been a while." She studied him for a moment. They hadn't ended badly exactly. They'd ended the way some family relationships end, in a slow drift accelerated by her father's death and the complicated business of a grieving family failing to stay in contact with enough frequency to keep the contact from feeling like an event. She didn't hold it against him, and she didn't think he held anything against her. They'd just both gotten lost in their own lives and let the distance grow until it required an occasion to cross. "It has," she said. "Can I?" He gestured at the field. "Come on," she said. She walked him through it. The same circuit she had walked Fletcher Cade through, more or less, though she said different things, because Tommy Whitlock had grown up hearing the family history of this farm and didn't need the context a stranger would need. She showed him the center rows. She showed him the largest pumpkin. She showed him the south section. He was quiet for a long time, walking beside her, looking at things without commenting. Then he stopped in the center row and stood very still for a moment. "Pop would have lost his mind over this," he said. His voice had changed. Lower. "Your dad? And yours?" He turned and looked at her. "Earl would have been out here every morning. He'd have been impossible to talk to." He almost smiled. The good kind of impossible. Mara looked at the center row pumpkin with its wrist-thick stem. She thought of her father standing at the field edge in the early morning, listening. "Yeah," she said. "I'm sorry I wasn't here," Tommy said. "After he died. After things got hard. I should have been." She considered several responses and settled on the simplest one. "You're here now." "I heard at the auction," he said. "What Gideon Rusk said. I wasn't there, but I heard." "It's past," Mara said. "It made me angry when I heard it." "Good. It was worth being angry about." She looked at him steadily. "It's still past. I don't need to stay in it." He nodded. He looked at the field one more time. "What do you need for Saturday? For market?" She almost said she was fine. She stopped herself because she wasn't completely fine. She'd been trying to solve the problem of loading alone in a way that didn't require her to spend more hours than she had, and she hadn't solved it satisfactorily yet. "Another pair of hands for loading would help," she said, "if you're offering." "I'm here Friday night," he said, "and Saturday morning." "Okay," she said. They didn't hug. They weren't quite back to being people who did that yet. But they walked back to the barn together, and she showed him the wagons, and they talked through the loading plan, and by the time he left in the late afternoon, they had a practical sequence worked out, and she felt, for the first time since March, that she was not entirely alone in what was about to happen. She went and fed the captain, who was at the fence and had opinions about the timing, and she leaned on the railing and looked at the field in the late afternoon light, and the orange of the center rows caught the low sun and held it, and the whole field glowed with the particular color of something that had kept its promise against all reasonable expectation. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the field wasn't already saying better than she could. She pushed off the railing and went inside. 3 days. 3 days, and she'd know everything she'd spent since March trying to prove. Friday came in cool and clear, which was the kind of morning that felt like the season making a concession. Like August had finally admitted it was done and stepped aside for something with a little more dignity. Mara was up at 4, as she always was, but there was a quality to this particular 4 o'clock that was different from all the ones before it. The waiting was almost over. After 6 months of moving towards something she couldn't fully see, she was now close enough to touch it, and that proximity had its own particular weight. Not lighter than the uncertainty had been, just differently heavy. She did her field walk in the dark with the flashlight, the same circuit she'd been running every morning since June, and the pumpkins she moved the beam across were the same pumpkins she'd checked 2 days ago and the day before that, but they looked different now in the way things look different when you know you're seeing them for the last time before everything changes. The largest one in the center row had a small split in the soil beside its base where the weight of it had finally pressed the vine anchor into the ground, and she crouched down and looked at that for a moment. The pumpkin itself was fine. The split was just the earth accommodating what had grown in it. She stood up and finished the circuit and went back to the barn. Tommy arrived at 6:30 in a truck that was cleaner than the one he'd driven Thursday, which told her he'd thought about this more than he'd let on. He had coffee in a thermos and 2 sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, which he handed to her without ceremony. "Figured you wouldn't eat," he said. "I had crackers," she said. "That's not eating." She didn't argue with that because it was true. She took the sandwich and they stood at the tailgate of his truck and ate before they started, which was practical. You didn't load pumpkins on an empty stomach, not the kind of pumpkins she was dealing with. And they talked through the sequence again without making it a conversation about anything other than logistics, which was the right approach. And they both understood it without discussing it. The loading plan was simple in concept and physical in execution. They'd start with the south section, working outward from the vine rows, cutting each pumpkin at the stem with the good knife Mara had sharpened the night before, carrying or rolling them to the wagon depending on size, loading the heaviest ones on the bottom. They'd do the south section first, then the center rows last, because the center rows were the pumpkins she was most protective of, and she wanted to be the one handling the largest ones. Tommy didn't question the order. He just started with the south section. So, the work had a rhythm to it that Mara hadn't anticipated, a call and response between the two of them that developed without being planned, the way it does when two people who grew up doing the same kind of work find the natural sync of it. Tommy had farmed with his father through his 20s before he'd shifted into county road maintenance, and he hadn't lost the physical grammar of harvest work. He knew how to carry a heavy pumpkin against his hip rather than straight out from his body. He knew how to read the stem before he cut to make sure he was getting the right length. He knew not to drop them or stack the top tier too high without checking the bottom layer first. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The field made its own kind of noise, the dry rustle of vine being moved aside, the satisfying thud of a heavy pumpkin being set into the wagon bed, the sound of boots on soil that had been broken open and transformed from the sealed, pale hardpan it had been in the spring. An hour in, Mara cut the stem on a pumpkin from the south section that required both hands to lift, and when she got it to the wagon and set it down, Tommy looked at it for a moment. "What do you think that weighs?" he said. 30, maybe 35 pounds, she said. "More than that." He picked it back up, assessed it. 40. She looked at it. Maybe 40. And that's not even one of the big ones. He set it down carefully. "Mara, what's the center row got in it?" "Let's finish south first," she said, and went back for the next one. She wasn't deflecting. She just needed to stay in sequence. The center rows were where she was going to need all her composure, and she wasn't ready to start spending it yet. The south section took 2 hours and filled the rebuilt wagon and a third of the good wagon. Mara called a water break when they'd done the last south row, and they sat on the tailgate of Tommy's truck and drank and looked at what they'd loaded. The rebuilt wagon sat lower than it had when empty. The pumpkins in it were stacked 2 deep in the bottom and 1 layer across the top, and the color of them, the dark orange of full ripeness, some of them shading toward the rust red that happened at the very end of ripening, was something Mara hadn't let herself look at all at once until now. She'd been looking at them one at a time, pumpkin by pumpkin, all morning. Looking at the whole wagon was different. Tommy followed her eyes. "Your dad grew pumpkins every year I can remember," he said. "Every year," Mara confirmed. "I remember one harvest. You were maybe 10, I was 12. He had a center row pumpkin that won the county fair. Biggest in the county that year. Earl was so calm about it, you'd have thought he pulled one like that every season." "He did that," Mara said. "He'd get excited about something privately and then never let on. You'd only know he was proud of something by the way he kept not saying anything about it." Tommy was quiet for a moment. "You do that too," he said. She considered this. "Probably," she said. They finished the water and went to the center rows. The center rows were different to walk into now that she was harvesting rather than just checking. All season she'd moved through them in the role of observer, assessing, monitoring, adjusting irrigation, watching for problems. Now she was here as the person who was going to end the season, to cut what had grown and take it away, and the field received that differently. Or she received the field differently. She wasn't sure which. The largest pumpkin, the one she'd been watching since its color had first come in, the one with the wrist-thick stem and the near-perfect distribution of color from base to top, and the particular heft she could feel from a foot away just looking at it, was in the 3rd row from the east fence, on a vine she'd marked with a small piece of orange wire back in July, so she'd always be able to find it. She came to it last. She cut everything around it first, working the center rows in a sequence that left this one for the end. Not because it required a ceremony, but because she needed to be settled when she got to it, needed to have the work rhythm in her body and the composure stored up. Tommy came and stood beside her when she crouched at the stem. She made the cut clean. The stem was thick enough that she had to rotate the knife once to get through it, and when it came free, the pumpkin shifted and settled slightly on the ground with its full weight. She put both hands on it and lifted. It was heavier than she'd estimated. She'd been telling herself 45 pounds. Her arms said 50 plus. Her lower back, which had been managing all morning without complaint, suddenly had a specific opinion. "Here," Tommy said, and got his hands under the other side. They carried it to the good wagon together and set it in the front corner where she could see it for the whole drive to market. Tommy stepped back and looked at it. Then he looked at her. He didn't say anything for a moment. Earl, he said finally, just the name. Not a sentence, just his uncle's name, said quietly, in the direction of the pumpkin. Mara pressed her lips together. She turned away and went back for the next one. Her eyes were doing something she wasn't going to let develop into anything further, and working was the most reliable way she knew to keep that in check. They finished the center rows by 2 in the afternoon. They were both filthy, and their backs were doing things that would require a day or two of recovery, and the good wagon was loaded and the rebuilt wagon was full, and there was still a pile of pumpkins on the ground near the east fence that was going to need a third run with the truck bed because the 2 wagons couldn't hold everything. Mara stood looking at the pile. Then she looked at the field, at the stripped vines now, the empty rows, the turned earth. "How many?" Tommy said. She'd been counting as they went, keeping a running tally in her head. She'd been doing it the way she did the water math, not writing it down, keeping it internal, not making it real enough to lose. 280, give or take, she said. Tommy was quiet. Pumpkins, she said, in case he'd misheard. I heard, he said. 280 pumpkins off 2 acres that everyone said was dead. She looked at the wagons, the pile by the east fence, the stripped field. The northeast corner underperformed. I said it would. She paused. But the center and the south, Mara. Tommy turned and looked at her with an expression that was not complicated. It was just plain. You need to let yourself know how big this is. She looked at him for a moment, then she looked away. I will, she said. Aftermarket. He understood that. He let it go. They started loading the truck bed. 1. She didn't sleep well Friday night, which she'd expected. She lay in the dark and ran numbers and then told herself to stop running numbers and then ran them again. She was calculating at market rate, and the numbers kept coming back to the same general range, and the range was enough to do what she needed to do if the market held, and if buyers showed up in the volume she was counting on, and it was the if buyers show up part that she couldn't resolve by lying in the dark, calculating and would only know by being at the market at 7:30 Saturday morning with her wagons loaded. She got up at 4:30. She fed the piglets. The captain was at the fence with his usual 4:30 energy, and she leaned on the rail and looked at him in the dark. Today, she said. He pressed his snout against the rail. Either it worked or it didn't, she said. We'll know by noon. He moved away toward the water trough. She watched him go and felt something almost like fondness, which surprised her a little even now, 6 months into knowing him. She went inside and changed into clean clothes. The best she had, which was not a very high bar, but she'd washed them specifically, and they were pressed. And she put on her father's work coat because she always put on her father's work coat, because some habits become part of who you are before you've noticed it happening. And she drove the first wagon into town at 5:45 with the truck pulling it and Tommy following behind with the second. The county market opened its vendor lots at 6 and ran until midday or sellout, whichever came first. Her father had held the same spot for 30 years, center section, end of the 3rd row, where the morning foot traffic came through first. She didn't know if that spot was still available. She hadn't called ahead because calling ahead required a certainty she hadn't been willing to claim. She would take whatever spot she could get and make it work. The spot was open. The vendor on one side was a woman she recognized who sold sweet corn and gourds, and the vendor on the other side hadn't arrived yet. She pulled in and backed the wagon into position, and when the headlights caught the loaded wagon, the woman with the sweet corn and gourds came over and stopped. She was maybe 70 years old, had been selling at this market since the early 90s, and had the weathered, unimpressible quality of someone who'd seen most things that county markets had to offer. She looked at the wagon for a long moment. Whitlock land? She said. Yes, Mara said. The woman looked at the largest pumpkin sitting in the front corner of the good wagon where it had been since 2 o'clock the previous afternoon. Then she looked at Mara. She didn't say anything else. She just nodded, once, with an expression that Mara didn't have a clean word for, something between recognition and respect, and went back to her own stand. Tommy pulled the second wagon in beside the first. They positioned the truck bed accessible from the back in case they needed to restock from it. By the time they'd finished arranging the display, not elaborate, just organized, the large pumpkins in front where people could see them, the mid-sized ones stacked behind, a hand-lettered price board Mara had made Thursday night. It was 6:15 and the market was beginning to fill. She stood behind the stand and waited. The first 20 minutes were ordinary. People moved through the market with the particular morning market energy of shoppers who are scanning rather than looking, taking inventory of what was available before they committed to anything. Several people walked past her stand, glanced at the pumpkins, and kept walking. One man stopped, picked up a mid-sized pumpkin, looked at the price, and set it back down. He bought corn from the woman next to her. Mara watched this without expression. She was cold. It was September, and the morning was properly cool now. And she had her hands in the pockets of her father's coat, and she was very deliberately not reading anything into the first 20 minutes. Then a woman with 2 children stopped. The children were maybe 7 and 9 years old and had the immediate, uncomplicated response to large orange pumpkins that children have, which is to say they both said, "Whoa," and went directly to the largest one in the front corner. The older child tried to pick it up and could not. "Mom," the younger one said, "it won't move." The mother laughed. She looked at Mara. "How much?" Mara told her. "For the big one?" "For the big one." The woman considered it for a moment the way people consider large purchases at market stands, doing the calculation between want and reasonableness. Then she said, "We'll take it, and 2 of the medium ones." Tommy lifted the large pumpkin into their wagon. They'd brought a small garden cart, and the 2 children walked alongside it down the market aisle like they were escorting something important, which Mara supposed they were. She sold 4 more pumpkins in the next 10 minutes, then 8 in the 20 minutes after that. By 8 o'clock, the stand had a line. Not a theoretical line, not a polite cluster of people vaguely near each other. An actual, physical line of customers waiting their turn, reaching back past the sweet corn stand. The woman with the sweet corn and gourds looked at it, and then looked at Mara and raised her eyebrows in an expression that needed no translation. Mara was busy. She was pricing and helping carry and making change from the cash box she'd brought, which she'd loaded with change she'd sorted and counted twice Thursday night. And she didn't have time to think about what she was seeing because the seeing of it was happening in real time and required her complete functioning attention. Tommy handled the lifting. He worked without direction, reading what was needed and providing it, and she was grateful for him in a way she hadn't been able to fully feel until now, when it was actually happening and she could see what it would have cost her to do this alone. By 8:30, the front layer of the good wagon was gone. The county went quiet around 9 o'clock. Not literally. The market was full, noisier than the morning had started. But there was a specific, notable quiet that came to the space around Mara's stand when Calder Boone arrived. She saw him from a distance, moving through the market with the unhurried walk of a man who wasn't there primarily to shop. He was wearing the same green canvas jacket he wore at the feed store, and he had his hands in his pockets, and he was making his way toward her stand with the purposeful direction of someone who knew where he was going. He stopped in front of the remaining pumpkins. He picked up one of the large ones from the center row. Not the largest, which was already gone, but a significant one that required both hands to lift comfortably. And he turned it over and looked at the base, the way farmers look at produce to understand what it took to grow it. He set it down. He looked at Mara. "What's your center section soil reading like?" he said. She blinked. "I don't have a meter reading. I'm going by hand and eye." "Estimate." "Dark, loose, well-structured, holding moisture at twice the rate the northeast corner does." He nodded slowly. "That's good soil," he said. "That's properly restored soil. Most people can't bring depleted ground back that fast, even with equipment." "I had 6 months and 34 pigs," she said, "and you knew what you were doing." "I knew enough," she said. He looked at the pumpkin he'd set down. He looked at it for a moment in the way she'd seen him look at things when he was revising his position on them, carefully, without rushing. Then he picked it up again and held it. "I'll take this one," he said. "And I want to say something." She waited. "I told you the land was gone," he said. "I was wrong. I was looking at the surface and concluding about the whole, and that's—" He stopped. "That's a mistake I should know better than to make after 40 years in this business." She looked at him steadily. "You were trying to help me cut my losses." "I was telling you to quit," he said, and said it plainly, without softening it. "And you were right not to listen to me." Around them, the market continued its noise and movement. The line at her stand had temporarily shortened while customers made their selections, and Tommy was restocking from the truck bed, and there was a family 3 people back from Calder deciding between 2 mid-sized pumpkins and asking him questions he couldn't answer from where he was standing. "Thank you," Mara said, "for coming and saying that." He paid for the pumpkin. He carried it himself, which was an effort at his age with a pumpkin that size, and she didn't offer to help because she could see he wanted to carry it. He moved away through the market crowd, and she watched him go, and then someone was asking her about prices, and she turned back to the stand. What? Gideon Rusk arrived at 10:15. She'd half expected him and half not. He wasn't a market person. He had people who handled his marketing, a crew for harvest, a system that didn't require him to stand at a stand on a Saturday morning. Showing up here was a choice rather than a routine, and she registered that without letting it mean too much. He was alone. He came to the stand and looked at what was left. Still a substantial number. She was going through them faster than she'd projected, but the truck bed reserve was holding. And then he looked at her. He didn't open with anything deflecting or tangential. He said, "I owe you an apology for what I said at the auction." Mara looked at him. The market noise continued around them. "You said it in front of a crowd," she said. "You might consider that when you think about what an apology looks like." Something moved across his face. Not offense, he absorbed it. "You're right," he said. "I do." She waited to see if there was more. "I've been farming this county for 40 years, he said. "I thought I knew what was dead and what wasn't. I was looking at your field like I looked at—" He stopped, started again. "I've bought 3 farms in the last decade from people who gave up. Every one of them had soil that could have come back with the right approach. I didn't look hard enough to see it, and neither did the people selling. I bought land I should have helped save instead." This was more than she'd expected him to say. She didn't interrupt it. "I don't know if that's an apology or just a confession," he said, "but I wanted to say it." "It's both," she said. He nodded. He looked at the stand. "Can I buy your largest remaining pumpkin?" "Tommy," she said, without turning her head. Tommy looked over. "Which one are we calling the largest remaining?" Tommy assessed the stand quickly. He pointed to a pumpkin in the second row from the front, a center section pumpkin she'd estimated at around 50 pounds, deep rust orange from base to crown. "That one," he said. Gideon Rusk looked at it. "How much?" She told him. He didn't negotiate. He paid it and stood with the pumpkin balanced in both arms, which he managed better than most people his age would have, and he looked at Mara. "How did you restore the soil?" he said. It was the same question he'd asked in July when he'd come to the property. This time it wasn't casual. It was something closer to genuine need. "Walk me through it." "Compaction issue first," she said. "The surface was sealed. Seeds and water couldn't penetrate. You address the compaction before you address anything else." He listened. "Pigs root deeper and more thoroughly than any manual tillage I could afford," she said. "They break the surface and turn the old organic material into the soil at the same time. 6 weeks of consistent rooting across the full area changed the structure completely. Then the rain had somewhere to go. The seeds had room to move." "What about the seed stock?" "They were already there. 2 seasons of planting into soil that couldn't receive them. They went dormant." He was quiet for a moment. "The seeds were there the whole time." "They were always there," she said. "The soil just needed someone to fix it." He looked at the pumpkin in his arms. Then he looked at the field, at her wagon, at the crowd around the stand, at the market full of people, some of whom had slowed down and were listening to this conversation with the unsubtle attention of people who understand they're witnessing something that will be talked about. "I have 400 acres of South Field that's been underperforming for 6 years, Gideon Rusk said. "I've thrown equipment and fertilizer at it and gotten marginal results." She knew what he was moving toward. She waited for him to get there. "I'd like to talk to you about a consulting arrangement," he said. "When you're ready, no urgency, but I want to talk." The market went quiet around them in that particular way. Not actual quiet, but the kind of attentional quiet where you can feel people listening. "After today," she said. "After I've closed out and dealt with the season, then we can talk." He nodded. "Fair enough." He shifted the pumpkin in his arms. "You know the county's going to be talking about this field for a long time." "They were already talking about it," she said. "Just differently." He almost smiled. Not quite, but close enough for her to see it. "Yeah," he said. "Differently." He turned and carried his pumpkin into the crowd. The line came back. It came back around 10:30, and it didn't stop. Tommy was restocked from the truck bed at a pace that they hadn't projected in their original loading plan, which was a problem in the best possible sense, the problem of having more demand than capacity, the problem her father would have been delighted by and calm about, the problem she'd spent 6 months working toward without ever letting herself believe it would actually be the problem she faced. She made change and answered questions and helped people choose between sizes and watched the wagon levels drop with an efficiency that was almost alarming. A group of 4 women who appeared to be together bought 11 pumpkins between them. A man she recognized from the far end of the county road, someone who had slowed his truck past her property multiple times over the summer, bought 3 and then turned back and bought a 4th. Patrice Delgado showed up at 11 and stood at the back of the line. When she reached the front, she looked at what was left. The selection was significantly reduced now, the largest pumpkins mostly gone, the remaining inventory strong but not what the first hour had looked like, and she said, "I'm too late for the big ones." "There are still good ones," Mara said. "I know." She picked 2 medium ones and paid for them. Then she didn't leave. She stood to the side and looked at the stand and at Tommy and at the remaining line. "How many have you moved?" "I stopped counting at 200, Mara said. "And you've got more in the truck bed still?" "Less than I started with." Patrice was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know, when I asked you in July if you knew or if you were hoping, I remember. I've been thinking about that, the distinction." She shifted the pumpkin she was holding. "I think I asked the wrong question." "What's the right question?" Patrice thought for a moment. "Whether you would have done it differently if you'd known for certain you were just hoping and not knowing." She looked at Mara. "Would you?" Mara thought about March, the $31, the tin box on the kitchen shelf with the fishing lures, the sick piglets in the corner of the auction pen, Gideon Rusk's voice in the barn saying what it said. "No," she said. Patrice nodded, like that confirmed something she'd already decided. "That's the right answer," she said. She picked up her pumpkins and walked away through the crowd. By 11:45, the truck bed had 6 pumpkins left in it, all of the smaller, lower-quality ones that she'd priced accordingly, and that had moved slowly all morning. The 2 wagons were empty. The cash box she'd packed with change and empty space was neither of those things. Tommy came and stood next to her, and they both looked at what remained. "6, he said. "6, she agreed. He looked at the cash box. She didn't open it in front of people. She'd do that at home, private, where the numbers were hers alone first before they became anything else. "Do you know yet?" he said. "I have a general sense," she said. "I'll know the specific number when I count it at home." General sense good or general sense great? She looked at the 6 remaining pumpkins. She looked at the stripped wagons and the truck bed. She thought about the pile of debt that had been growing for 18 months, about the neighboring parcel she'd been watching since her father mentioned it 2 years ago. Small acreage, good soil if it was managed right, being sold by a family that had moved away and wasn't farming it. She thought about the morning she'd woken up with $31 in a tin box in a field everyone had finished mourning. "General sense great," she said. Tommy didn't say anything. He just put his hand briefly on her shoulder. One firm press, the way family does when words aren't quite right for the moment, and then he went to start breaking down the wagon. She stood at the stand alone for a moment. The market was thinning out now, the late morning crowd cycling toward noon and departure. The woman next to her with the sweet corn was wrapping up. Somewhere across the market aisle, a child was running and getting called back. Normal Saturday sounds, ordinary county market sounds, the sounds she'd been hearing all her life. She pressed her hand against the side of the cash box. 6 months ago, she had driven out of the livestock auction with $31 spent, $0 left, 34 sick piglets in the back of a truck, and a field full of dead soil. She had driven home alone while the county laughed. She had sat in the parking lot of that auction barn for 2 full minutes before starting her engine, pressing the flat of her hand against the steering wheel and feeling the full weight of what she'd just done and what it would cost her if she was wrong. She hadn't been wrong. She wasn't going to let herself feel that in pieces, standing at a market stand on a Saturday morning. She was going to finish breaking down, load what was left, drive home, count the money at the kitchen table where she could be alone with it, and let herself feel everything then. She reached over and picked up one of the remaining 6 pumpkins, a medium one, good color, clean stem, nothing dramatic about it, and she held it in both hands for a moment. It had grown in her father's field, in soil his hands had worked for 30 years, and that had died and been brought back, in earth that everyone in Red Hollow County had decided was finished. She set it in the truck bed. "Let's go home," she said to Tommy, who was unlatching the wagon hitch and didn't need to be asked twice. She drove home with the windows down, the September air cool against her face, the empty wagons rattling behind her with the distinctive lightness of wagons that have successfully given up their load, and she let herself think for the first time all season about what came next. Not about debt or numbers or the neighboring parcel or Gideon Rusk's 400 acres. Not yet. Just about tomorrow. About walking the stripped field in the morning and seeing what 2 acres of restored soil looked like after harvest. About the South Pen and the captain and the 34 animals that had started this whole thing and that were now fat and healthy and entirely unaware of it. About the soil that was dark and loose and warm with the memory of what had grown in it. She turned down the county road. The farm appeared on her left, the barn, the house, the fence lines, and beyond them the stripped field, already golden in the midday light, the vines still on the ground from harvest, the earth visible between them in the deep dark color of soil that had been fed and turned and given a reason to live again. She slowed the truck without meaning to. She looked at it for a long moment from the road, the way you look at something that has required everything you had and has given back more than you asked for. Then she turned down the access road and drove home. She counted the money at the kitchen table. She told herself she would do it calmly, methodically, the way she did the water math, just numbers, just arithmetic, just a practical accounting of what the day had produced. She spread everything out on the table, the bills sorted by denomination, the coins in the small cloth bag she'd used for change, the folded receipts from the 3 larger transactions where she'd written amounts on paper because her hands were full and she hadn't wanted to miscount in the moment. Tommy had offered to stay. She'd told him she was fine. She'd meant it the way she meant most things, not as a performance of strength, but as a genuine assessment of what she needed, which was to do this alone, in the kitchen where her father had sat every harvest evening and done the same thing at this same table under this same light. She started with the bills. The counting took 12 minutes. She counted twice, not because the first count was wrong, but because she needed the second count to confirm that the first count was right. Numbers that size, arriving after a season like this one, required confirmation. Your mind does something to numbers it wants to believe, rounds them up, smooths the edges, makes them into what you need them to be rather than what they are. She was aware of this tendency, and she didn't trust it. The second count matched the first. She sat back in the chair and looked at what was on the table. It was enough to clear everything. Every outstanding balance on the farm debt, the operating line, the equipment note her father had taken out 2 seasons before he died, and that she'd been making minimum payments on because that was all she could manage. The smaller amounts that had accumulated through the bad harvests like sediment, all of it, cleared. And after that, enough left to make a serious offer on the neighboring parcel. Not a casual offer, a real one, with a deposit that would be taken seriously, from someone who had been watching that acreage with the quiet attention of a person who couldn't yet afford to act and had been holding the intention in place until she could. She put her hands flat on the table on either side of the money. She sat like that for a while. The house made its sounds around her, the particular settling noises of an old farmhouse at night, the refrigerator's hum, the wind moving through the oak trees along the north fence. She'd been listening to these sounds her entire life. They had a different quality tonight, or she had a different relationship to them. She couldn't have explained precisely what had changed in the texture of sitting in this kitchen, only that something had. She thought about March. She thought about the tin box with the fishing lures. She thought about driving out of the auction parking lot with $0 and 34 sick animals and the sound of the county still laughing. She thought about her father standing at the field's edge in the early morning, not doing anything, just standing there. She gathered the money carefully and put it back in the cash box, and set the cash box on the shelf beside the spot where the tin used to sit before she'd moved it to the barn when she'd needed the tin for something practical and couldn't quite bring herself to use it for that, and had put it somewhere she wouldn't have to think about it every day. She turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. She slept for 9 hours without interruption, which was the most she'd slept at a single stretch in longer than she could clearly remember. Sunday morning came in quiet. She woke at 5:30, which was late for her, and lay in the still dark bedroom for a moment with the particular clarity that comes after the deep sleep of genuine exhaustion finally resolved. Not the foggy half-awareness of her usual mornings, where she was running the day's list before she'd fully arrived in it. Just clear, present, here. She got up and put on her father's coat over her pajamas because the September mornings were cold now in earnest, and she went out to feed the piglets before she did anything else. The south pen was noisy with its usual pre-dawn energy. The captain was at the fence when she came around the barn corner, which she'd come to understand was simply how he was. Always already awake, always already at the fence, always already in possession of opinions about how slowly the food was arriving. She filled the trough and stood at the railing while they ate, the way she'd been doing since June, the ritual of it so built into her mornings now that she couldn't imagine the day beginning differently. She looked at the 34 of them, fat, healthy, loud, opinionated animals with no particular awareness of what their 6 weeks in that field had set in motion. The captain had a notch in his left ear that he hadn't had in March. She'd never figured out how he'd gotten it, just one day it was there, and the 3 that had been lying down in the auction pen corner were indistinguishable from the rest of them now. Strong, solid, impossible. She thought about the $31. She thought about what $31 had bought, not just in the material sense, not just the pumpkins and the market receipts and the numbers on the kitchen table, but in the broader sense. The debt gone. The neighboring parcel within reach. The field transformed. The soil alive. The county, which had laughed, now quiet in the particular way that comes after you've watched someone prove something you were certain couldn't be proved. She thought about what her father had said when she was 14 and had asked him what he was listening to. She'd spent 20 years thinking he was being poetic. She understood now that he was being precise. She drove to the county records office Monday morning when it opened and asked about the neighboring parcel. The parcel was 8 acres, she'd always known it as 8 acres, had looked at the county records on it twice in the past year, in the abstract theoretical way you look at things you cannot afford and are not ready to stop wanting. It had been listed for private sale for 14 months by the family that had inherited it after their father died and had no intention of farming it. The woman at the records counter was named Sylvia, and she'd worked there for over 20 years and knew every parcel in the county the way librarians know books. Not every detail, but the location, the general condition, the history. She pulled up the listing and looked at it and then looked at Mara. Whitlock land, she said. It wasn't a question. Everyone in Red Hollow County understood the geography. Adjacent, Mara said. Southeast corner borders my property line. Sylvia looked at the screen. They had an inquiry last spring, but nothing came of it. It's still available. She looked at the asking price. It's priced a little optimistically for the soil condition. I know, Mara said. I've looked at it. Degraded? Similar to what my field was, Mara said. Sylvia looked at her for a moment with the careful expression of someone who had heard the market gossip from Saturday and was doing the recalculation in real time. Ah, she said. Can you get me the contact information for the family's representative? Mara said. The conversation with the family's representative, a man named David Pryor, who worked out of a small real estate office 2 counties over and handled rural property sales with the distracted efficiency of someone managing more inventory than he had genuine attention for, happened by phone on Monday afternoon. Mara was direct. She gave him her offer. It was below asking, but not insultingly below asking. She'd done the calculation based on actual comparable sales in the county for land in similar condition, and the number she gave him was a serious number from a serious buyer, and she said so without apology. Pryor was quiet for a moment. The family has been patient about getting their price, he said. I understand, Mara said. They're welcome to keep being patient, but the land's been listed for 14 months, and the soil condition is going to keep holding the price down as long as it stays the way it is. Are you saying you could address the soil condition? I'm saying I've done it before, she said. On adjacent land. You can drive past and see the results. Another pause. Longer this time. Let me call you back, he said. He called back Tuesday morning. The family would take her price with a standard deposit to hold the parcel during the title process. She said yes and hung up the phone and stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hand still on the receiver. 8 acres. Bad soil, as things stood. Soil that looked, from the road, not unlike her own field had looked in March. Pale, compacted, sealed against anything trying to grow in it. She knew what to do with soil like that. She paid the farm debt on Wednesday. She drove to the county bank where she'd been making payments for the past 18 months with the particular expression of someone managing something they're not winning, and she went to the desk of the loan officer who handled agricultural accounts. A man named Garrett, methodical and not unkind, who had never quite said she was in trouble, but had said it in every way that didn't require words. And she told him she wanted to pay off the operating line and the equipment note in full. Garrett looked at her for a moment. He opened the accounts on his screen. He looked at the numbers. In full, he said, confirming. In full, she said. He was quiet for a moment in the way that people who work in money are quiet when they're processing a reversal they didn't see coming. Then he said, "Give me a few minutes to run the payoff figures." He came back with the paperwork 12 minutes later, and she signed where he indicated, and he processed the payment. And when he handed her the receipt copies, he looked at her with an expression that was more personal than his professional manner usually allowed. "I heard about the harvest," he said. "Word travels," she said. "In this county it does." He stapled her copies together with the precise, habitual motion of a man who has done that exact action thousands of times. "Your father would be glad," he said. She took the copies and folded them and put them in the inside pocket of the work coat. "Thank you, Garrett," she said, and meant it without making it complicated, and walked out. She sat in the truck in the bank parking lot. The debt was gone. The operating line that had been accumulating since her father's last difficult season, the equipment note with its immovable monthly amount, the smaller balances, gone. All of it, gone. She had receipts in her pocket that said so. She'd expected to feel lighter. She felt instead a strange, full stillness. Not relief exactly, more like the moment after you've been carrying something heavy for so long that you've forgotten you're carrying it, and then you set it down, and your body doesn't immediately know what to do with the absence of the weight. She sat with it. She started the truck and drove to the neighboring parcel on her way home. She pulled off the county road in front of it and got out and stood at the fence line looking at the 8 acres of degraded field. It looked exactly like her field had looked in March. Pale surface, compacted, the kind of ground that discouraged you if you let it tell the whole story. Scrub grass at the fence lines. No signs of recent work. A field that had been given up on. She put her hand on the top fence rail and looked at it for a long time. She thought about what she'd need. The south pen could be extended. She'd need fencing materials and another 2 weeks of work, but it was doable. The captain and his 33 companions had more than earned their keep on 2 acres. She'd see what they could do on 8. She'd need to look at the water situation, whether the east well had range to serve additional acreage or whether she needed to think about another source. She'd need to walk the 8 acres properly, understand where the compaction was worst and where there was still some structure left, plan the pig rotation differently because 8 acres was a different challenge than 2. She could see it already, not as a fantasy, as a plan. The difference between those two things was what 6 months of actual work had given her, the ability to look at a damaged piece of land and see not what it was, but what it was still capable of becoming. She got back in the truck and drove home. Fletcher Cade came on a Thursday in mid-September as he'd asked in August, with a notebook and a camera and the carefully contained energy of someone who'd been thinking about this visit for weeks. He walked the field with Mara for 2 hours, and she answered every question he asked with the same directness she'd given him before. The practical specifics, the sequence, the decisions she'd made and why, the mistakes she'd made and what they'd cost her, the things she'd gotten right more by instinct than calculation. He asked about the northeast quadrant, which had underperformed. She explained the timing differential, less preparation time before the seeds emerged, and what she would do differently if she had the season to run again. He wrote that down carefully. He asked about the water management during the July dry spell. She walked him through the irrigation adjustments and the well monitoring and the calculations she'd been doing on the back of envelopes at 2 in the morning. He wrote that down too. They stood in the center section, which was stripped now, the vines drying on the ground, the soil open and dark between them. He crouched down and put his hand into the earth and then looked at it on his palm. "This is genuinely good soil," he said. "This is soil that could sustain cultivation for years without significant amendment." "I know," she said. "What you did here isn't just a recovery story," he said. "It's a methodology. It's reproducible." He stood up. I want to write it up for the extension bulletin, with your permission. And I want to list you as the primary. I don't want to write it as an observation of your work. I want to write it with you." She considered this. She'd been thinking, since his first visit, about what it would mean to make the process available to other farmers in the county, to the 3 operations he'd mentioned with similar degradation, to whoever came after them. The knowledge itself was old. The 1987 extension booklet was proof of that. But knowing and executing were different, and what she'd learned in 6 months of execution had value that a booklet written 40 years ago couldn't contain. "After I've done the neighboring parcel," she said, "I want to run it twice before I tell anyone how to do it." He looked at her. "You bought the adjacent land." "I signed papers last week." He was quiet for a moment. Then, 8 acres? 8 acres? Same soil condition? Similar. He looked at the stripped field. He seemed to be adding something up. "You're going to do it again." "I'm going to do it differently," she said. 8 acres with more pig rotation planning and better water source assessment from the beginning. I already know what I got wrong the first time." Fletcher Cade looked at her with an expression that was trying to stay professional and was only partially succeeding. "The Extension Office," he said carefully, "has a small grant program for innovative soil remediation projects. It's not large, but it would cover materials costs for a second implementation." "How small?" she said. He told her. It was not a lot of money. It was, however, more money than $31, and it was offered by a person who wanted to document the process rather than own it, and it came with no strings she could see attached to it that she wasn't willing to live with. "Send me the application," she said. He wrote something in his notebook. Then he looked up. "Did I ask you something personal?" "You can ask." "When you were at the auction, when Rusk said what he said." He paused. "What did you think in that moment?" She considered this. It was a fair question, and she'd had enough time and enough distance now to answer it honestly, rather than reflexively. "I thought he was probably right," she said. Fletcher Cade looked at her with surprise. $31 is not a lot of money," she said. 34 sick piglets on dead soil is not a conventional plan. The odds were not good. She looked at the field. "I raised the card anyway because the alternative was going home and watching the field die by degrees while making practical decisions. And I'd already been doing that for 2 seasons, and it wasn't working, and I couldn't do it anymore." She paused. "Being sensible about something that isn't working is just failing slowly." He wrote that down. "You can use that," she said, "if it helps the bulletin." "What?" Calder Boone came back to the property on a Saturday morning 3 weeks after the market, and this time he brought something. A heavy paper bag that he carried from his car without explanation and set on the tailgate of Mara's truck and opened. Inside were 6 printed documents, soil amendment guides, cover crop rotation schedules, and one piece that was older than the others, its paper yellowed and the print slightly smudged on one edge. He spread them out on the tailgate and she looked at them. "Extension materials," he said, "from before the budget cuts. I had them in the store's back room for years. Forgot they were there until you mentioned your father's booklet." He looked at the papers. "Some of these might be useful for the new parcel." She looked at the documents. The oldest one was dated 1984 and was titled Soil Compaction Recovery in Row Crop Fields, Mechanical and Biological Approaches. She picked it up and read the first page standing at the tailgate. Her father had known about this, not just from the 1987 booklet she'd found in his things. These were the same series, the same approach, the same knowledge base. Earl Whitlock had understood what the land needed and had been working with that understanding for years. And she had grown up watching him listen to the field without knowing she was watching someone who already had the answer to a question she would spend years trying to formulate. She set the paper down. "Calder," she said, "did my father ever talk to you about this? About biological tillage? About using animals for soil restoration?" Calder was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that suggests he's measuring something before he says it. "Your father had ideas about soil management that were ahead of what most people in this county were doing," he said. "He used to talk about how the land communicated its needs if you paid enough attention. Most people thought he was being poetic." She looked at him steadily. "He wasn't being poetic," she said. "No," Calder said. "He wasn't." He gathered the papers gently and put them back in the bag and handed it to her. "Take these. They're yours more than they're mine." She took the bag. She thought about her father coming home with dirt under his fingernails, and that particular tired satisfaction she'd watched from the porch her whole childhood without understanding what she was looking at. She'd thought she was watching a man who loved his work. She had been. But she'd also been watching a man who understood his land in a way that she was only now, at 34, beginning to fully inherit. Tommy came for dinner on a Sunday in October. It wasn't planned. He called that morning and asked if she was around, and she said she was. And he showed up at 4 with a covered dish his wife had made, which was a detail that told her the visit had been discussed before he called, that it was considered, that it was not just dropping by. They ate at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd counted the money in September, and they talked in the way that family talks when the distance between them has been partly bridged but not fully, when there's still careful navigation happening under the ordinary conversation. His wife's name was Renata, and Mara had met her twice in 4 years, which was not enough to have a real sense of her, but enough to have a good impression that she trusted. Tommy had 2 kids, 11 and 8, who he mentioned in the way parents mention children who are not present, with a particular fond exhaustion that communicated more than the specific things he said about them. "Bring them sometime," Mara said. He looked at her. "To the farm?" "To the farm. They can meet the captain." Tommy laughed, a real one, surprised out of him. "The captain would traumatize my 8-year-old. "The captain would be an education," she said. "That's not the same thing." He looked at her across the table. Something settled in his face. "You seem different," he said, "than you did in the spring." "I'm tired in a different way," she said. "It's more than tired," he said. "You seem—" He thought about the word. "Settled, like something got resolved that you'd been carrying for a while." She thought about this, about what had been unresolved. Not just the debt, not just the field, but the deeper question underneath all of it. The one that had been running since her father died and that she hadn't been able to articulate until she'd answered it by action rather than thought. Whether she was the right person for this land. Whether she could be what it needed. Whether the faith her father had placed in her by leaving her the farm, not in his will, because there was no other option, but in the deeper sense, the sense of having taught her to listen to the land and trusted that the teaching would take, whether that faith was warranted. She knew the answer now. "Something did get resolved," she said. He nodded like he understood what she meant without needing her to say the rest of it. That was the thing about family. The good kind of family. The kind that had found its way back to being present. They could read the shape of a thing without requiring you to fill in every detail. After dinner, they sat on the porch with coffee and looked out at the farm in the October evening light. The south pen was visible from there, the piglets moving around in their particular evening way. The field beyond was stripped and dark, the vines fully dried now and lying flat on the surface, the soil open underneath them. "What happens to the field over winter?" Tommy asked. "It rests," she said. "Cover crop maybe, if I can get the seed in time. Or just let it sit. The structure's good enough now that I'm not worried about erosion. In the spring I'll decide what to put in it." "Not pumpkins?" "Maybe not only pumpkins," she said. "The soil can support more than one thing now." He looked at the 8 acres beyond the fence line, the neighboring parcel, visible from the porch in the low evening light, its pale compacted surface in contrast with the dark of her field. "And that one?" "Pig rotation starts in November," she said. "I'm dividing them into 2 groups and running them in shifts across the 8 acres. It'll take longer than 2 acres did, but I know more now than I knew in the spring." "You'll need more pigs," he said. She'd been thinking about this. "I'll need more pigs," she confirmed. "Auction?" She picked up her coffee. "Auction," she said. "Whenever the next one runs." Tommy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the particular dry evenness of someone making a joke that is also not entirely a joke, "Think Gideon Rusk will have anything to say this time?" She considered this. She thought about Rusk at the market, holding his pumpkin in both arms, asking how she'd restored the soil. She thought about what he'd said about his 400 Southfield acres, and the offer of a consulting conversation that she hadn't had yet and wasn't going to rush. "He's going to want to know how many pigs I'm buying," she said, "and how much I paid for them." Tommy laughed. She let herself laugh too, which was something she hadn't done much of in a long time, and the sound of it in the October air on her porch felt like something she was reclaiming. Not performing, not managing, just the simple involuntary thing that happens when the weight is gone and the moment is right. The consulting conversation with Gideon Rusk happened on a Thursday in late October. He came to the farm rather than suggesting they meet somewhere else, which she'd noted and chosen to read as deference. He sat at the kitchen table where she'd offered him coffee, which he took black, and they talked for an hour and 40 minutes with the focused, detail-oriented seriousness of two people who are both good at what they do and have stopped needing to perform anything for each other. He described his Southfield degradation in the specific terms of someone who had been looking at the problem closely. Compaction primarily in the upper 18 inches, organic matter depleted from years of aggressive chemical fertilization, water infiltration rate down significantly from the field's historical baseline. He had soil tests, which he'd brought, and she looked at them on the kitchen table and asked questions. She asked more questions than she gave answers at first. She wanted to understand what she was working with before she said anything. She'd have to walk back. The Southfield was not the same problem her field had been. Larger scale, different history, different compaction profile. The approach wouldn't be identical. She said so. He listened without interrupting, which she respected. It'll need a mapped approach, she said, section by section, based on the compaction readings. You can't run a blanket pig rotation on 400 acres the way I ran one on 2. You need to identify the worst sections and start there. Let the improvement sequence forward. She looked at the soil tests. Your organic matter reading in sections C and D is actually worse than mine was. What does that mean? It means sections C and D are where you start, she said. And it means you need more animals than you think. And you need to be patient about a timeline that doesn't fit a single growing season. He was quiet for a moment. 2 seasons? Minimum, she said, on sections C and D. The outer sections with better baseline readings, maybe 1. He looked at the soil tests on her kitchen table. Outside, the October wind moved through the oaks, and the captain made his periodic South Penn announcement. Gideon Rusk sat with the information she'd given him and did not rush it. What would you charge? He said. For ongoing consultation. She had a number. She'd calculated it with the same care she'd applied to every other number this season. Not what she needed, not what she thought he'd accept without argument, but what the knowledge and time were actually worth. She told him. He didn't negotiate. He said, "That's fair?" She'd expected him to negotiate. The absence of it recalibrated her assessment of him slightly. Not dramatically, but enough to notice. "One more thing," he said. "Sure." The auction comment. He looked at her directly. "I said I'd consider what a public apology looked like. I've been thinking about it." She waited. "The county market runs every Saturday," he said. "Same people every week. I thought I'd do it there. Publicly. Whatever you think is appropriate." She studied him. He was 60-some years old and owned the largest operation in Red Hollow County and was sitting at her kitchen table offering to say in public what he'd said in public the wrong way 6 months ago. She could see what it cost him to make the offer. Not enormously, because he was a man who knew how to absorb a cost, but something. "I don't need a performance," she said. "I need it to not happen to the next person it could happen to." He looked at her. "If you want to do something useful with it," she said, "talk to people who have land they've given up on. Tell them about soil restoration. Tell them some of that land isn't gone. That's more useful than an apology at a market stand." He was quiet for a long moment. "That's a harder thing to do than the public apology," he said. "I know," she said. He nodded once, slowly. "All right," he said. He finished his coffee. He gathered the soil test copies she'd annotated with her questions and notes in the margins. At the door he paused and looked out at the farm. The South Penn visible from the doorway, the stripped field beyond, the 8 adjacent acres in the distance. "You're going to run the methodology on the new parcel," he said, "starting in November. And it'll work." She looked at him. "The soil on the new parcel needs the same things mine needed. I know how to give it those things now." She paused. "It'll work." He looked at the 8 acres for another moment. Then he said quietly to himself as much as to her, 400 acres. "We'll get there," she said. He left. She watched the truck go down the access road and turn north on the county road, and she stayed in the doorway for a moment in the October air sat. She signed the final papers on the neighboring parcel on a Friday morning in late October. The title office was in the county seat, 20 minutes from the farm, and the transaction itself was unremarkable in the way that legal paperwork is always unremarkable. signatures on numbered lines, initials in boxes, a notary with a stamp who confirmed identities without apparent curiosity about the specific circumstances. David Pryor, the real estate representative, was there in person for once, which she suspected meant the family had asked him to close it properly. She signed her name 8 times in various places and received her copies and shook hands with Pryor, who told her the land had good bones and seemed to believe it, and she walked out of the title office into a Friday morning that was cold and clear and smelled of the season turning seriously toward winter. She sat in the truck for a moment. 8 acres, legally hers. 2 acres she'd rebuilt from dead soil. 34 pigs she'd bought with her last $31. 1 farm she'd inherited from a man who had understood the land better than anyone she'd ever known and had trusted her with the understanding without making sure she could see it yet. She thought about something her father used to say, one of those practical observations that she'd stored in the back of her mind without fully understanding it until she needed it. He said it usually when something had gone wrong, when a crop had failed or equipment had broken down at the worst possible time, or the weather had done what the weather does without consulting anyone's plans. He'd say, "The land's not against you, it just needs to know you're serious." She thought he meant it as comfort. She understood now that he meant it as instruction. She started the truck and drove home. On the first Saturday of November, she walked both properties. She started with her own field, the 2 acres that had started this whole thing, moving along the perimeter in the early morning the way she'd done every morning since March. The vines were fully dried now, lying on the surface in the flat, papery way of things that had finished their work. The soil between them was dark and open and held the cold well. She put her hand into it at 3 different points along the center row and felt the same thing at each point. Warmth, give, life, held in the structure of earth that had been fed and broken and given space to be what it could be. She walked the fence line of the neighboring 8 acres next. She didn't go in. The gates were padlocked until she was ready to start the pig rotation in 2 weeks, and there was nothing to see inside yet that she couldn't see from the fence line. The pale, compacted surface, the sealed ground, the field that looked from every practical angle like something finished. She put her hand on the top fence rail and looked at it for a long time. She saw what everyone else who drove past this field saw: degraded ground, depleted soil, a place that had been used up and abandoned. She also saw what she'd learned to see, what 6 months of paying close enough attention to a dead field had given her the ability to see in a way she hadn't been able to in March. She saw what it was capable of. She saw the seeds that were probably already in there, waiting for conditions to change. She saw the soil structure that existed underneath the compacted surface and that could be restored. She saw the dark, warm, living ground that was under there somewhere, waiting for someone to understand what it needed. The captain made noise from the south pen, carrying across the cold morning air with his characteristic lack of restraint. She pushed off the fence rail. She had work to do. Not the desperate provisional work of a person trying to stop something from ending. The work she'd been doing in March and April and May, always one step ahead of the worst possibility, always calculating what she could lose. This was different work. This was the work of someone who had learned what she could do and was choosing to do more of it, who had proved something not just to a county that had laughed, not just to the neighbors who'd driven past with pity and curiosity, but to herself, to the part of herself that had stood in the auction barn with a bidding card and $31 and heard a crowd laugh and raised the card anyway. She walked back to the barn. She checked the pig rotation schedule she'd drafted on paper and pinned to the barn wall. She checked the fence materials she'd ordered, arriving next week. She checked the water assessment notes from the east well. She had calculations to run and a cover crop decision to make for her own field before the ground froze, and a meeting with Fletcher Cade about the extension bulletin that she'd been putting off until she felt ready to sit down and articulate what she'd learned in a form useful to other people. She had, in other words, more than enough. The morning was cold, and the sky was the particular flat gray of early November, the trees along the north fence holding the last of their leaves, the oaks moving slowly in a wind that carried the smell of the season properly settling in. She stood at the barn door and looked at the farm, both fields, the south pen, the house, the access road running out to the county road where cars had slowed and stopped all summer to look at something everyone had decided was impossible. She thought about what Patrice Delgado had said, that most people needed to know before they moved, that Mara had moved and then found out. She thought about what she'd told Fletcher Cade, that being sensible about something that isn't working is just failing slowly. She thought about her father's coat, which she was wearing, which she would probably always wear because some things become part of who you are before you've decided they will. Because some inheritances aren't in the paperwork, they're in the habits and the knowledge, and the particular way you learn to stand at the edge of a field in the early morning and listen to what it has to say. The land wasn't against you, it just needed to know you were serious. She went back inside to start the day. Behind her, the 2 acres of restored field sat in the cold November morning, dark and open and alive, holding winter in soil that had earned its depth, not waiting to be saved, not waiting to be given up on, just resting, the way good land rests between seasons, with everything it needs already in it, patient as seeds, ready as spring.